Thank you for joining us today. My name is Yongki Hong. I am a senior associate at Scan Legal PC. Today, we are going to spend some time talking about E2 visa options for low investment amounts and high risk E2 visa cases. And we are very lucky to have our firm's managing partner, Kelly Weiner, as a speaker for this webinar. I'll be covering the beginning parts of our presentation, and Kelly will take over the rest. Before we dive in, let me briefly introduce our firm and go over a few housekeeping items. We are a full-service immigration law firm. We offer services in a wide range of areas, including E2, O1, TN, L1, H1B, and any types of employment or family-based green card cases. But having said that, we are especially well known for our work and reputation in E2 visa world. We have built very strong reputation in this area, and we have processed hundreds of E2 visa cases. Many of them have a higher risk and have worked with the U.S. consular offices all over the world. So one of the reasons for this kind of E2 visa focus is that our firm was founded by our founder Ian Scott with the E2 visa himself. He knows the E2 visa world inside and out. That's why we built our reputation from it. At the end of this webinar, we'll send you several useful tools, a copy of a PowerPoint presentation we'll go through today, a link where you can download the guides with more details on visa options, a link to sign up for additional webinars, and another link to a webinar recording on YouTube. We encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly post our immigration-related videos. We also send you a link where you can set up a private consultation with our team. Finally, for any questions, please type them into chat box or Q&A box. We'll address all the questions at the end of our presentation. With that, let's get started. So, yeah, what are the E2 visa requirements? Basically, E2 visa is basically based on a treaty agreement between United States and foreign country. And currently, United States have signed the agreement with more than 80 countries. The list of E2 countries occasionally change, but not often. Like, I don't know, every few years, a few countries would be added or fall off from the list. So you should check the official E2 country list before you actually submit your E2 visa application. But keep in mind that you don't need to be born from the treaty country. You just need to hold a passport from the treaty country. So for example, you're born in India, which is not a treaty country with the United States, but later immigrant to Canada and have a Canada passport now, then you are obviously eligible for the E2 visa case. You must own at least 50% in the E2 company. The corporation type does not matter, but if we are building up corporation and in the United States, we recommend LLC or C Corp because these are the types giving you very simple and clear supporting documents. You could have a business partner. For example, if you are Canadian and your business partner who owns the other 50% of the company has an Italian passport, then your business partner can also apply for his own E2 visa based on the exactly same company. But you have to make sure that you have at least 50% ownership, and this requirement continues when you renew your E2 visa later. So you should consult with an immigration attorney whenever there is a change of ownership structure in your E2 business. The next requirement is you must make a substantial investment. Then what is substantial investment? Well, we'll talk about more detail later with Kelly, but generally speaking, it means the sufficient amount to make the E2 business fully operational. So I'll give you an example. If your business is a consulting company, then obviously the required funds to establish the business are less than a manufacturing facility. However, can you claim that your consulting company only needs $5,000 to make it fully operational? Uh, Not likely. To meet the standard of consular officers and satisfy their review standard, we generally recommend to invest minimum $50,000 regardless of your business type. I'm sure Kelly will address this issue in more detail later on. For now, let's go over with each bullet point here. So fund must be at risk. It means the wire transferred investment funds must be used and spent before you actually submit your E2 visa application. For example, you transferred $100,000 to your E2 business account as an investment, and you need to spend and pay a certain amount of money to build up your business. For example, you need to obtain the lease agreement for your office. You need to buy necessary equipment, computers, whatever scanning machines that you need, or to obtain professional accounting, marketing, or legal services for your business. Then you will need to show that you have spent sufficient amount out of $100,000 in your B2 visa applications. The next one is a source of a fund that should be satisfied. Any legitimate source can be used, but please keep in mind that the government wants to see very clear fund flows from the documentation. So you should try very hard to keep it simple and easy for the government officers to understand how the fund were originated and how it came to the E2 business corporate account. How much is enough? Well, again, we'll talk about it in more detail in next slides. But generally speaking, again, we recommend you invest and spend at least $50,000. The typical E2 expenditures. So this bullet point is to show how you should spend your investment for the purpose of your E2 visa applications. But you do not want to spend several $100s for a beautiful dinner with a potential business partner and claim as a business expenses for your E2 visa application. In real life, yes, you could claim it for your company tax deduction purpose, but such is not highly recommended for your E2 case. So keep in mind that inventory, equipment, website, office supplies, office warehouse rent, marketing, business entity setup, these are the most preferred expenses for your E2 case. So move on to next slide. The next requirement, business cannot be marginal. This is a kind of whole point of E2 business, creating jobs and contributing to the local economy in the United States. So if your business is barely making income just to cover the E2 investor and his family members' living cost, government will not like it. Therefore, it is very important that your business should create enough incomes to hire US employees. You can even hire an employee before you apply for your E2 visa application. Such would actually strengthen your E2 case. So if you think that your investment is kind of low and risk, then it may be good strategy to hire a US employee before your visa application. Next requirement, business must be real and operating. What it means is that when you arrive at United States with your E2 visa, your business must be already able to ready and start operating the day when you came to the door. So to prove this element is satisfied, you will usually need to submit a signed commercial lease, business entity document, and company website and contract with the other customers and licenses as well. And next, you will solely develop and direct the E2 enterprise. It simply means you are coming to the United States only for your E2 business. Your E2 business is basically your full-time job. Thus, so you should not driving like Uber at night as a side hustle or just become a passive shareholder of your E2 business. You should be actively participating in the E2 business's daily operations. But just one practical tip about this element is that when you submit your application to USCIS, they are a little more concerned to see if we are actually performing services without any employees, because such would be direct competition against the US local labor market. So if you have been running your E2 business too long without any employees, you should consult with an immigration attorney to carefully develop your E2 visa application. So next, you have intend to return to home country upon expiration of your E2 visa. The E2 visa is not a green card. It's not permanent residency. It does not automatically lead to a green card either. So it only allows you to enter United States for a temporary period to develop and run your E2 business. But it does not mean you cannot renew your E2 visa or obtain your US permanent residency. You could renew it and eventually go after for the US green card. But you should carefully design the case direction with your immigration attorney for the green card directions. The next one is a few options for the starting point. You can start your business or buy an existing business, or you can sign into a franchise agreement. If we are considering buying an existing business, please consider that business already has a good number of employees. Because again, having existing employees before your E2 visa application is submitted is a really good plus point for your case. Also, you could arrange an escrow consideration in the business transactions. This is only one exception to the requirement where I said that you should have spent enough money before applying E2 visa. The contract language in this business transaction example will say that the transaction money will be withheld in the escrow account and will be released upon the approval of your E2 visa application. And this type of a transaction language has been acceptable by government authorities. So next slide. How long is the E2 visa valid? It depends on the treaty agreement between US and the foreign country. It could be very short, like 3 months or 5 years. And does it mean I could run my business only for 3 months if a visa is only valid 3 months? No. Regardless of your visa validity duration, you will typically get 2 years of your E2 status when you come to the United States. So you could run your E2 business for 2 years, but once you go out from United States, you have to reapply and renew your E2 visa again. So with that in mind, let me turn it over to Kelly, who will guide you through the next part of our presentation. And she will cover strategies to overcome the low investment amount and how to wisely spend the money to improve your E2 visa case. So please stay tuned.
Thank you, Yongki. So We're going to talk about a very common question, which is how much investment is enough? And in the regulations, it says you have to invest a substantial amount of money, but there is no kind of minimum set amount. So even though we kind of talk about an investment would normally be greater than 50,000, this is not kind of a hard and fast rule in the regulations. This is something we recommend based on kind of our experience and seeing what consulates, want to see when they consider what is a substantial investment. So, even though we sometimes have clients say, well, I'm a consultant, I can start up my business with just my expertise and I already own a laptop and maybe I can spend, $1,000 on some office expenses. That's just never going to be considered to be enough to be substantial. And so this is where we kind of recommend, kind of up to 50,000, or more for kind of service-based companies, or it could be more than that depending on the type of business. So when we say the money must be spent, it must be at risk and irrevocably committed. So just putting money in a business bank account is not going to be enough. They want to see that you have actually put the money at risk in a commercial sense, and that if the business were to fail, you would risk that money. The reason why they want to see this is to make sure that if a person is issued, a 5-year visa, if they have money on the line, they're going to enter and actually run that business. They want to make sure they're not just giving out a 5-year visa and then someone might enter the US, pull all that money out of a business bank account and do something else. So this is kind of one of the ideas behind this requirement. So as it says here, the investment and substantiality depends on the type of business. So if you're starting, for example, a wedding photography business, this is service-based. There's going to be, certain things you need, right? Cameras, lenses, a website, marketing. But what if you're starting a car manufacturing company or kind of a commercial real estate development company? Those investment amounts may need to be much higher because it's going to depend on the actual startup cost for the type of business that you're starting. And what they do is look at a proportionality test for a startup. So how much money you have invested versus the usual cost to establish that type of business. And when you have a kind of lower investment amount, and when I say lower, I mean anything under kind of $250,000, you want to show that you've spent 100% of the cost to set up that type of business. So, again, in the regulations, they don't say this is the amount to set up this business type. This is where you can provide some background information, maybe some industry articles, some market research reports, that might say, hey, normal startup costs for this type of business are X. And you want to be able to say, hey, I've spent at least that, or ideally even more than that. And that can be very helpful for showing them that you meet this proportionality test. When you're buying a business, they're going to look at kind of the purchase price, and then what is the fair market value of the business. In an arm's length transaction where you don't know the seller, they often will say, okay, whatever the business was offered for on the open market is going to be a substantial investment if you pay that amount. That's going to be the fair market value of the business. If you're in a situation where you're purchasing a business from a family member or a friend, or you're purchasing a percentage of a business, you do want to make sure that maybe you've got an evaluation, maybe you've had a CPA discuss or weigh in on, why this is why the purchase price is the fair market value of the business, because they may have some questions like if the tax returns are showing really high profits and really high assets, and you've been offered 50% of the business for, $40,000, they would have questions about that. Is that really substantial? Is that really the fair market value of the business? So these are things to keep in mind when you're doing the investment. And we can move to the next slide. All right. So, what are some strategies to deal with a low investment amount? We've listed some things here. We'll go over them. You want to make sure that you have every other part of the application being very strong when you have a low investment amount. So, Yongki went over earlier. There's different requirements for the E-2, marginality, real and operating. Proof you're going to develop and direct the business. So, if you do have a lower investment amount, you want to make sure that every every other part is very strong. So ideally, you would have some experience running this type of business. Maybe you've hired an employee or two employees before you apply. You want to make sure that, from the real and operating perspective, you have, any licenses you need. You've opened your business bank account. Maybe you have letters of intent or contracts from people that are interested in your services. Maybe you have a patent. Maybe, you have a business partner. So you do want to just make sure that every other part of the application is very strong if you know, hey, the investment amount's going to be on the lower side, because then you can argue, even with this lower investment, we really are well positioned to succeed. So getting contracts, letters of intent, these are very important, particularly for things like consulting companies, where there's just so many consulting companies. They want to see proof that there are really people interested in your services. It can also be helpful to go to your local chamber of commerce where your business will be set up, maybe have an initial meeting with them. They may be willing to write a letter, especially if you join, saying they're excited about you bringing your business to their community and creating jobs and, helping the local economy. If the business, let's say that you have a US business partner, or you're outside the US and the business has already started to operate, and you've collected revenue from clients, that's something you can highlight as well. Just show the business is a good, viable, business. A strong business plan is always going to be very important for a startup. This is going to outline, this is what this business does. Here's how we're going to price our services or our products. A hiring plan, a 5-year hiring plan showing that you will hire people and that there's kind of a realistic financial plan as well. So, 5 years of financials, a profit and loss statement, balance sheet, cash flow statement, and just kind of a written explanation of here's why, these businesses, this business will be successful. It's not required to hire employees prior to applying, but it does help, especially with marginality. Also with real and operating, maybe you have, and then if you have to pay a payroll provider, if you've paid any salary to these employees, these are all really good things for your application, both in kind of raising the investment amount with those payments and then also showing the real and operating nature of the business. You could also consider a CPA letter. So perhaps you find a CPA who works in your industry or with small and mid-sized businesses. They can evaluate your investment schedule, your business plan, and perhaps write a letter opining that this is a reasonable and substantial investment, for this type of business and has the capacity to be successful. Okay, so what are some common E-2 visa expenditures? So we've listed some here. As Yongki said earlier, there may be things that maybe you can write off as business expenses on your tax return, like meals, flights, things like that. But those are not going to be so strong for the E-2. Some consulates even go so far as to, on their FAQs on their website, they say don't include those types of travel expenses. They don't want to see them. But some things that are stronger are things like website setup and hosting. So almost every single business is going to need some type of website. And if you're the type of business where you're going to have kind of a shop, maybe where you're selling things, you want to make sure that that is very, kind of comprehensive and set up. Most businesses are going to need computers, printers, scanners, tablets, iPads, any type of kind of hardware that you need, for yourself or for your employees could be helpful. Inventory. So if it's the type of business where you're importing, inventory or exporting, you can kind of have that, maybe make a pre-purchase of that, before you submit. Furniture, but only if it's used for business purposes. So if you're saying, well, I'm going to get a dining room table and I'm going to work at my dining room table, that's not going to be useful for the E-2. But if you get an office space and you need to get desks, you need to get chairs, you need a whiteboard, those types of things can be helpful. Also, trademark or intellectual property purchases or development can be used, although it's not very successful to argue kind of sweat equity. So if you say, well, I've spent my time developing this and I want to value my time, that is not very successful. But if you do have some IP and you've had a separate valuation of it, that might be able to be used as part of your investment. Employee payroll and payment to independent contractors, can all be included. Legal fees as well, related perhaps to your corporate setup or if you're purchasing a business or, for the immigration side. Lease. So if you want to prepay for a commercial office space, that can be a good expenditure. Notably, if you have a home office, you cannot use kind of your mortgage or your rent for your residential space. That's not going to be a strong expense. Also, software, advertising, office supplies. These are just some of the most common expenses, but you do want to think about what is my business and then what will I need to actually run my business. So again, for example, if you have a wedding photography business, you're going to need camera equipment, right? So though think about kind of what are the specialized things you'd need for your business, and then also kind of what does any business need generally, marketing, website, equipment. Right. And then some weak expenditures. We've kind of covered this, so travel, flights, accommodations like a hotel, meals, entertainment, expenses paid to related parties. So, for example, let's say you have a business in Germany that you own 100% and a business, in the United States, and you want to pay your business in Germany to do something for your US company. It's not a very strong expense because they may look at that and say, well, you just paid yourself. So we feel that, the money is not actually a risk in the commercial sense because it just went to another business that you wholly own. If it's a very large business, it's something that you can consider, but again, it's going to be better if you pay, for example, a U.S. company to actually do that setup than to pay a related company where they may not feel the money is truly at risk. A car, I just want to go over. This can work sometimes depending on the type of business you have. So let's say that you're doing kind of a mobile, pet grooming business. Obviously, you will need some type of vehicle for that. Like a basic car just to drive to and from work, that's not going to be a strong expense. But if it is the type of business where you really need a work truck, like construction, or you're doing, a food truck, then a vehicle could be potentially included. We can go to the next slide. Okay, now let's talk about some specific businesses and the challenges that might, kind of be faced with those and some tips for making them successful. So we do a lot of consulting businesses for the E-2 and, theoretically, very low investment is needed to start a consulting business. It's a really common question that we get or comment from people saying, well, I don't think I could get an E-2 because I just don't have anything I can spend money on. And it is, it can be a challenge, right? Because as an entrepreneur, you want to spend as little as possible. However, for the E-2 visa, you do need to make that substantial investment to prove that you are committed to successfully operating the enterprise. So, a few things you can do. So, one is you can get articles, again, like industry reports, maybe magazine articles from business magazines in the industry that shows here's how much it costs to start up a business. That being said, even if you get an article that says, oh, you can start a consulting business for $2,000, you can't, it's really not going to be successful to just invest $2,000 and claim that's substantial. Even though hypothetically you could start the business that way, you're not going to be able to demonstrate to the officer that you've invested enough that you're committed to successfully operating the business. So, you want to consider kind of spending more money, which maybe as an entrepreneur you wouldn't do, but when you're an entrepreneur applying for the E-2 visa, it's going to be a necessary part of the application process. And we don't advise people to just spend money on things that are useless to you. What we recommend is kind of maybe look forward 6 months, a year, 2 years. What are going to be the biggest expenses for you when you're running the business? And see, maybe you can pull some of those expenses forward. So that you're really buying things that are going to be useful for you, but kind of, in the long term. So for office space, you can prepay maybe for 6 or 12 months for that commercial space. For equipment, perhaps you don't need a new laptop yet, but you get one. Or you're going to hire an assistant at the end of the year. Maybe you purchase the equipment you need for that assistant now, even though normally you would wait until they were hired. Also good to invest in marketing. So let's say that you were going to go ahead with a really bare bones website and just get that sorted out later. It's a really good idea to maybe do a more comprehensive website now. Maybe invest in discussing with the PR agency about how to get, your business and your marketing, up and running. Similarly, you could hire employees. So maybe you were going to, wait and hire an employee later, but perhaps you hire an administrative assistant early on to help with some of the things to do that you can't easily do while you're not in the United States. And then anything that you pay to that employee can be included. Notably, you can't include the employee's kind of whole salary, nor do we recommend kind of prepaying salary. That's not really going to work, for a few different reasons, including kind of employment law reasons. Um, but let's say you have a signing bonus for somebody and that's, standard for your industry. Those types of things can be included. And you also want to spend over a large variety of categories. So it's not successful necessarily to say, okay, I'm going to spend, $40,000 on a really comprehensive, website and online shop, and that's the only thing I'm going to spend. Because what they want is for you to show you've spent everything necessary to get the business up and running. So they could look at that and say, yeah, you spent $40,000, but where's your computers? Where's your office space? Like what software do you need? Have you gotten all of that set up? So you do want to kind of again think about holistically, what does this business need? How can I successfully argue I've spent everything necessary in this variety of categories to get the business up and running? All right, real estate. So this is another area that has some challenges. I think when you're going for an E-2 and you have a kind of real estate focused company, you just know you're going to get some additional scrutiny. Part of the reason is that, there's kind of a misconception that people can just buy uh, like buy a house, for example, and put it in the name of an LLC, and then that is your investment. And that doesn't work for an E-2. That's not a real and operating business. That's just kind of a passive real estate investment. And so what you want to do is show that your business type is one that is real and operating. It's not just, hey, I bought some properties and I'm collecting, rental income, which would be again considered a passive activity. You have to show that employees are going to be needed to run this business, that you're going to take in revenue. So things that, our clients have done successfully in the past include things like a real estate brokerage firm, a property management company, renovation or construction companies, also house flipping sometimes, but only on a large scale. So, for example, we've had clients that perhaps had a portfolio of 30 to 40 homes, and they were kind of flipping those homes. However, when you do that type of, application, your investment amount is going to be much higher because you're not just buying kind of one property, two properties, and you really need to show how this is going to, be an active enterprise. Sometimes, if someone wants to do house flipping, but on a small scale, they might have a property management company, and then house flipping is kind of an ancillary service that they offer. And that can be one way that you can potentially do house flipping without having kind of the concern of needing to have so much startup capital and such a huge portfolio. All right, equity trading companies. So kind of some similar concerns to real estate, where they're concerned someone is just taking a stock portfolio, putting it in an LLC, and maybe doing, trading for themselves or for, kind of friends and family. You do want to show that there's going to be enough activity in the equity trading to, to show that you can hire employees and sustain that. It's also a highly regulated industry, and that's kind of similar for real estate. So you do have to show you're going to have proper licenses. And if you're setting up a company that requires kind of, multiple entities like a hedge fund or something, you do want to be very mindful about that. Which is the E-2 company? How do they all operate together? And are we explaining that properly to the officer so they understand the structure? Okay, so some reasons for E-2 visa denials. So, one would be low investment amount. We've talked a lot today about kind of how to try to strengthen cases with lower investment amounts. But there are some investments that are just too low. A client comes to mind who had spent $2,000 on his business and then put $98,000 in a business bank account. And the officer said, you need to spend more. So we, came to us at that time and we kind of helped the client spend more money, that was useful for the business and reapplied with an investment of, 50,000 spent and 50,000 in working capital and was ultimately approved. So one kind of benefit of a denial based on low investment amount is if you do have working capital and you're able to spend it, you can always reapply with having spent more. And, it's one of the easier reasons for denial to overcome if you are willing to spend more. Um, Nature of the business can also be a reason. So again, if you have a consulting business, if you have a real estate and equity trading business, these are just a few of the businesses that might kind of have some more scrutiny on them. And you just want to make sure that the case is strong if you are applying with that type of business. Filing location and venue are also very important. So consulates and U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which adjudicates changes of status to E-2, they all kind of take their own interpretation of some of the law and regulations. So even though the law is the same, there are certain filing locations or consulates where they may normally see multinational companies sending tons of employees, and maybe if they see a small investor investing 50,000, they're less friendly to that because they're used to seeing investments of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. There are some consulates, for example, Toronto and London come to mind, where they do see a lot of small investors. They do see a lot of small business owners, and they're more willing to, kind of entertain those types of cases. This also does switch over time. So consular officers rotate, consular chiefs change over time, the politics of immigration change, and all of these are relevant to kind of how receptive consulates might be to cases at certain times. And so you do want to discuss with your attorney to understand what are my options for where to file and what does that mean in light of my particular facts. The next two reasons are kind of related. So, if you have, for example, run a business in your home country for many years and you never hired employees, they may have a hard time believing that you're going to meet the marginality requirement and that you're actually going to hire workers in the US. And if they do have that concern over whether the business is going to create US jobs, that can be a reason for denial. So, if you have that fact pattern, if you have kind of run a business for a long time without hiring, it may be better for you to hire somebody before you apply just to proactively address that concern. You can also potentially have issues with the adjudicating officer. So consular officers are human beings. They have good days and bad days. They also have different levels of training, and the e-visas are a specialized type of visa. So you do need an officer who's kind of specifically been trained to handle that. If you do have an officer where you feel like they didn't understand the requirements or they were really off base, there's kind of limited things you can do to try to address that. There is kind of a legal net inquiry process if you feel that there was a legal error, but it's very long, very difficult to kind of get a favorable response with that. You may want to just consider reapplying, perhaps trying to address whatever the officer had issues with, or explain why you think the officer's interpretation was not correct. And usually consulates will try to give you a different officer when you reapply. It's not a guarantee, but they generally do try. Another reason might be you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So sometimes people will file on their own or maybe with a lawyer who's not an immigration lawyer and doesn't understand the E-2. Let's say, for example, you apply, but your entire investment is a loan that is secured by the E-2 business. You haven't invested anything because a loan that's secured by the assets of the E-2 business does not count as your investment. So let's say that's the case, or perhaps you don't own 50% of the business and the business isn't owned 50% by treaty country nationals. If you don't meet those requirements, you would just need to kind of go back, see if there is a way to meet those requirements, and then refile the case. All right, so let's turn to adjudication trends. So government posted approval rates, which are usually kind of a quarter or so behind, are about 80 to 90%. Our firm's approval rate is around 98%. I will say past results do not predict future outcome. No attorney can ever guarantee success in any visa process. That being said, we do have had a lot of success with the E-2s because as Yongki, noted, this is an area where we've specialized. Talking about timelines, so right now in London, if you're applying for an E-2, they are taking about 80 to 90 business days to call you for an interview. So it is a process of kind of months, not weeks. In Toronto, it varies, kind of goes between maybe 3 weeks, maybe up to 2 months. And so again, when you're thinking about your visa process or getting the E-2 visa, you really want to be thinking in weeks or months. It's not kind of days, as if let's say you were applying for a B visa and you can just submit a DS-160 and maybe get an appointment. Generally, timelines are variable. Most consulates are, again, weeks or months. There's a few outliers that are kind of still slow after the pandemic. Most consulates have returned to normal processing, but again, there are some outliers, and generally we do expect that timelines will continue, that timing will continue to kind of increase because there have been some important changes recently, such as interviews are not being waived, for most applicants anymore. There used to even be kind of waivers for longstanding waivers for people kind of under a certain age or over a certain age, and all of that has gone away. And so that means that consulates have to do more interviews and, they can't do the interview waivers. That means it's going to take longer because you have more interviews they have to do and the same or less number of consular officers. Um, so applying with USCIS versus the consulate. So with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, what you would do is a change of status or an extension of status if you're already in E-2 status. This is only available to you if you're already in the U.S. and a status that allows you to change status. So let's say that you're on an H-1B. And you want to change and start your own company, or you entered on a B-1 as a business visitor, and now you've decided, well, it's just better to do a change of status than go back to the consulate. If you've entered on ESTA, a USCIS change of status is not available. USCIS can be a good option for people with lower investment amounts. They're generally more receptive to that if it makes sense for the business. That being said, they also have a very strict view of the source and trail of funds. So if you have a very complex source of funds, it's not as good of an option for you. Additionally, you won't get a visa stamp that allows you to travel internationally. What you will get is an approval that allows you to stay in the US and run the business for up to 2 years. If you leave the US, you will have to go to a consulate, submit a brand new application. They don't have to consider the USCIS approval. With a consulate, so a benefit here is you can get a visa stamp, and many people can get a multi-year visa stamp, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Every time you enter, you can get 2 years on E-2 status. So this gives you a bit more time to get the business kind of up and running and successful before you have to go back and be evaluated at at the consulate or to get an extension. Additionally, consulates, many of them will take kind of a more holistic view of the source and trail of funds. They won't necessarily require such an intensive showing as USCIS does. Um, and I think for many people, the main draw of the consulates, one is maybe you're outside the United States, and so that's the only option you have. And another is just you are going to get that, visa stamp that allows for that international travel. So when you're applying, it's important to know kind of what is your consular post and what are those considerations for that post. So most consulates will have instructions on their website of how they want things submitted. For example, do they want an email? Are there page limits? Which order do they want things in? And some consulates are very, very strict on that and will send it back to you if you haven't done it properly. There's also consular preferences. So as I mentioned, there's some consulates that are used to seeing large multinational companies. Sometimes they'll want specific documents from tax documents from that country. So for example, in Argentina, they often want to see Argentinian tax documents, certain ones, to help support the source of funds. And then there's also consulates that require a CPA certification of your business plan. So Mexico comes to mind as a consulate that requires this. They would want to make sure that the numbers that are in your business plan have been reviewed and certified by a CPA. Our firm does have a CPA on staff, and so that is something we're also able to offer when we draft business plans for clients. All right, so some issues in complex areas to keep in mind. A common question is, do I have to hire employees before I apply for an E-2 visa? And the answer is no, it's not a requirement. However, it can be very favorable for the case. There are some consulates that also get confused about this. Taiwan comes to mind where, they were, insisting that was a requirement. It's not. That being said, it is very helpful, to hire employees. And if you're going to a consulate where you know that even contrary to regulation, they have wanted to see this, it's a good idea to try to meet that, requirement, kind of when you apply, or keep that in mind that it could strengthen your case. If you have a complicated source and trail of funds, as we mentioned, for USCIS, this is going to be difficult. You do have to document exactly where the money came from, where it was sustained, up to when it was spent. So for example, if you say, well, I earned it just savings from employment over the years, They're going to want to see your tax returns. They're going to want to see proof of your, your payroll entering your bank account being sustained there. If it was transferred to savings, if it was transferred somewhere else, you'll have to track that flow of funds up until when it was actually, deposited into the E2 business bank account and spent. Additionally, if you're getting a loan or you're getting a gift from somebody, that gift giver has to be comfortable sharing all that same documentation I just mentioned. So let's say they sold a property, they're going to want to see the property, sale document, proof of them receiving the money. If it was a few years ago, they're going to want to see where did that money go? Where was it sustained before it was sent? So this is quite complicated for USCIS, much less so at the consulates. Loans are permitted, unsecured loans or loans secured by the investor's personal property or assets. What does not work is a loan secured by the E2 company. So this comes up a lot in seller financing situations where somebody might purchase a business, but it's maybe they, put down a certain amount. Maybe they put down 40% of the purchase price and the rest is seller financing. This is not a good arrangement for the E2. Anything that's seller financing that's secured by the assets of the E2 business is not part of your investment. So it will be very hard to argue it's actually substantial. E2s for two investors. This is possible if you have an ownership of 50-50. Substantive changes to the E2 business after filing. So sometimes people will get a 5-year visa and say, okay, I have a 5-year visa, I can work in the US. So it's more nuanced than that. You can work in the US at the company that you presented to the consulate. That's generally going to be listed on your visa. And it needs to be that type of business. So any change to the ownership, let's say you sell 70% of the company to a US business partner, now you own 30%. Even though you have a 5-year visa, you no longer have a valid visa because your business does not meet the E2 requirements anymore. Similarly, a substantial change in the type of business that was not contemplated at your application can be problematic. Let's say you had a consulting business and now you want to shut that down and start a restaurant. You cannot do that without going back to the consulate or USCIS and getting a new approval. If let's say that you are a software services company, but you also wanted to do mobile app development and you put that in your business plan and you explained at the consulate, we're going to start off with software services. In year 4 or 5, we're going to move into mobile app development. That's fine because you've put that forward, because they are aware of it, that's not going to be considered a substantial change. But any kind of major changes that weren't contemplated have to be approved before you start that. Otherwise, you risk going to the consulate saying, hey, I started a new business, and they would find that you had violated your status. So a family business purchase, I talked about this a little bit previously. It's going to have more scrutiny on it. You want to make sure you have some type of objective evidence that verifies that the amount you're paying to purchase the business is actually the fair market value for the business and makes sense in light of the financials. So with the new administration, the impacts here. So there are some executive orders that are impacting cases, generally in the sense, not E2 specific, but across the board, kind of just more enhanced vetting, more possible likelihood of being put into administrative processing. This is where maybe either the consulate or, some other security agency has flagged the case for an additional security check. We generally also expect that consulates will want to see higher investment amounts, higher employee numbers, particularly US employees, because the purpose of the E2 is to help provide economic benefit, to the United States. And even though it's not required, they may also want to see more investments made in the US. So if you're making purchases, you're buying a computer or hiring a website designer, best to do that in the US. Although if you do, hire someone outside the US, you can still include it, but it might be viewed more favorably if it was made in the US. We will note that approval rates for the E2 did not change much from 2016 to 2020. All right, so we've reached the end of the presentation. We'll see if it doesn't look like any questions have come in. We'll wait a minute or so to see if any do, and if not, then we'll close.
Okay, well, thank you for thank you, Kelly. That was very helpful and very informative. If you guys have any questions, please type in, and if you don't, then I hope that you guys all enjoyed our webinar and find it very helpful and informative. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to visit our website and schedule a consultation with our team. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.